Hi, welcome back to another video about IBDP, environmental systems and societies. Today's video is about topic 1.5, humans and pollution. The first big idea from this topic is that pollution is by definition a human disturbance in the environment. You can see from this photo from where I used to live in Tanzania, this nice beach environment has clearly been disturbed by humans. I don't think anybody would argue that this is not a form of pollution. When we get into more depth into the definition of pollution, there's really four big elements to it. The first is that it's made or caused by people. The second is that we're adding something to the ecosystem. The third is that we add it to the ecosystem faster than the ecosystem can process it. And fourth, that once we have added it to the ecosystem, it has some type of impact on life there. So to recap, the four parts of the definition of pollution is that it's something that is made or caused by people, that we've added to the environment faster than the environment can process it, and which has an appreciable impact or effect on the living organisms in that environment. There's a bunch of different types of pollutants, and for your ESS exam, you should be able to discuss and give some examples of each of these types, at least broadly. Right? So first, we have organic or inorganic substances. Organic meaning carbon-based. So you may have things like sewage or animal waste, because those are nutrient rich and they come from living organisms. But a lot of organic pollutants are also long, complex carbon-based chains or big molecules built around organic carbon structures, particularly older pesticides, which we call persistent organic pollutants. And I'll get into those in a minute. We also have inorganic pollutants. And pollution may also take the form of excess energy in the ecosystem. That can be light pollution, as you see in this image, where over here on the left is what the night sky looks like inside a city, and over here on the right side is what it looks like in the middle of the ocean or deep in the African savanna, where you're far from large human settlements. Right? People may also have excess sound in the environment. We've seen this in urban landscapes where the noise of traffic overwhelms the sounds that animals, particularly birds, use to communicate, and it interferes with their ability to share information about predators or to find mates. We also may add excess heat, generally in the form of hot water, to aquatic environments, and that will change the temperature range for the organisms that live there and may push them beyond where they're comfortable or capable of surviving regularly. Another pollutant, and a lot of people don't think of this as a pollutant, but it is when humans bring in invasive species. We may not have made the invasive species, but it's something that humans have done, and we've added that to the environment. So this plant you see here is called kudzu, and it's pretty famous where I grew up in the United States. It's called the plant that ate the South. It was originally brought in for the good purpose of erosion control on road projects, but because it had evolved in Asia and not North America, there were no natural predators or herbivores in North America that ate this plant. So it just grows unchecked. And you can see here it grows and covers entire hillsides. These are all trees that it's grown across, and that it's covered, and it will kill those trees because they can't photosynthesize since they no longer have access to sunlight. And of course, one of the big pollutants that I think most people are aware of these days are the combustion of fossil fuels and the release of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into our atmosphere, thus impacting the entire planet's climate. Right? Pollution sources may be classified as either point source or non-point source. And I want to address the point source pollutants first, because that's the easiest one to kind of wrap your head around. Point source, right, is where the source of the pollutant comes from a single point. Right? This image kind of exemplifies that. It's a single pipeline going in, or it's a single factory that's emitting emissions into the atmosphere. It's pretty easy to identify where it comes from. Non-point source pollution is actually pollution where it's like a little bit of pollution from a variety of sources all cumulatively adds up to an excessive level of input into the environment that has an impact on the organisms that live there. A classic example of that is agricultural runoff. The runoff from one individual farm may be relatively small, but over the entire landscape, you have many farms, each of which contribute a small amount of pollution. Collectively, it becomes a significant impact on the environment. Right? The point source pollutants, again, usually a single source where you can find it on a map. Its regulation or control is relatively simpler because you can point directly to the source. Right? This particular storage facility has a bunch of leaking barrels in it. It's pretty easy to go in and fix that problem because you know exactly where the leak is coming from. Right? Non-point source pollution is much more challenging to deal with because it's coming from so many different sources. The sources might not all be within the same political boundary, and so they may be in different different jurisdictions, which means it's difficult. Not only is it difficult to identify who's in control, it's difficult to identify who is responsible for the release of the pollutant. Right? It generally requires large-scale interventions, which means getting a lot of people to change their habits. That's a tier one strategy. And while that's the most effective, it is also generally the hardest to accomplish. The next type of pollutant we're going to cover are the differences between persistent pollutants and biodegradable. Right? Persistent means they persist, they last a long time, they do not degrade. Right? And persistent pollutants lead to two different processes, one called bioaccumulation and one called biomagnification, which I'll explain in a little bit more detail later on. Biodegradable pollutants, as you might guess by the name, can be degraded or broken down through living processes. These are generally your organic pollutants. They may be more modern pesticides that are not persistent, right? Um, so your persistent pollutants, things like your persistent organic pollutants, things like DDT, heavy metals such as mercury or arsenic, right? The bodies of consumers cannot degrade or break down those pollutants. That's why they're persistent. And because they are persistent and they're not broken down and the body doesn't excrete them, right, they tend to build up in each individual organism's body. So when they build up, they accumulate over time in the organism's biomass. That's what we call bioaccumulation. So bioaccumulation is the slow buildup of pollutants within a single organism's body as it consumes the pollutant over time. What happens as a result of bioaccumulation is that the concentration of the pollutant within each trophic level in an ecosystem tends to increase, because if you have a pollutant in the water or in the sediment in an area, right, the producers that grow there will absorb a little bit of that pollutant. And every time your primary consumers eat some of those producers, they absorb and retain that pollutant. Then each time the secondary consumers eat some of the primary consumers, they also absorb and retain that level of pollutant. But because the primary consumers had more of the pollutant in them than the producers did, the concentration in the consumers is higher than it is in the producers. So each time you jump up a trophic level, the concentration of the pollutant also increases. And if you see the numbers in this diagram, they may increase by a factor of 10. And what that means is that by the time you reach the higher trophic levels, right, your apex predators or your tertiary consumers, you have high concentrations of persistent pollutants in their bodies. Right? So there's two processes here: bioaccumulation within an individual organism's biomass over its lifetime, and the biomagnification, or increasing concentration of a pollutant in trophic levels following the matter flow in a food chain. Right? So some good examples there of your persistent pollutants, again, are DDT. We're going to come back to DDT because it is an important example. Right? Pollutants can be classified as acute or chronic. Acute is very short term, right? This may be where there's a single accident. Maybe there's a chlorine leak from a swimming pool, or there's a train derailment, and whatever the train is carrying is some type of a chemical that's released as a result of the accident into the atmosphere. That's a short term, acute instance of pollution. Frequently, that's a point source pollution, but not always. Right? Chronic pollution is long term, and generally is it's kind of a long term, low level exposure. So you may not notice it, but it does create notable impacts on living organisms over time. Probably the most prominent example of chronic pollution is urban air pollution. It causes all types of respiratory illnesses and cardiovascular diseases in urban human populations, because a single day of urban air pollution may not have long-term effects, but many years of living and breathing that air pollution will have long-term effects. Okay? Pollutants can be broken down into two categories, either primary or secondary. We'll get into these in much more detail when we get to topic 6 about atmospheric systems and societies. But primary pollutants are the ones that, upon their release from their source, are active and have a negative impact on living organisms. That's different from secondary pollutants. Secondary pollutants are the result of chemical change or chemical reactions, either in water systems or in the atmosphere or in the soils. And the secondary pollutants are the ones that actually cause the impact on living organisms. Right? You don't need to know these figures. Right? You don't need to know the numbers. But if you'll notice here, right, a carbon monoxide is a common primary pollutant resulting from transportation. Nitrogen oxides come from stationary source fuel combustion. Those are things like your power plants that produce electricity. Okay? Your particulates may come from transportation. They may come from industrial processes, right? But these sulfur oxides, right? You come from solid waste disposal here. They may also come from your energy power plants, right? So being able to identify some specific pollutants and where they may come from would be useful examples to have on your ESS exam. The secondary pollutants here, your classic example is photochemical smog. Again, we'll revisit this when we get to topic 6, the atmosphere. All right. So the initial pollutant that is released is the nitrogen dioxide, which comes frequently from automotive exhaust. Right. The NO2 is not itself the thing that causes harm to human or other organisms, but what it does is it reacts with water in the atmosphere to form nitric acids and aldehydes, and those create the photochemical smog. And the smog itself is what has the impact on human health and environmental health. right? Pollution management strategies. This is probably one of the most important concepts in the environmental systems and societies course. So make sure that you know this part really well, right? Regardless of what the pollutant is, the strategies that people have for dealing with it can be broken down into one of three tiers. And you might want to think of these as most effective to least effective. Tier one is where we change the human behavior. In other words, we stop producing the pollutant entirely. And we do that by changing the way we do things. It may be replacing fossil fuels with renewable energy sources. It may mean replacing gas-blown plastics with some other way of protecting our items when we ship. But what it means is we actually stop producing the pollution in the first place. So we've actually stopped it at its source. We've dealt with the source of the pollution, right? That's why it's the most effective, because you stop it where it starts. The second tier is simply where we're still producing some of the pollution. We're just producing less of it, right? So we do this by increasing the gas mileage or the fuel mileage on vehicles. So a car that can go farther on a liter of fuel will release fewer grams or kilos of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere because it is burning less of the fossil fuels. Right? It's still releasing CO2 into the atmosphere. It's just releasing less of it. Right? The third tier is where we have to go in and clean up damaged ecosystems. This is the least effective because we're still releasing the pollutant into the ecosystem. We're just going in and cleaning up afterwards. So we clean up, and then because we're still releasing the pollutant, we have to go in and clean up again. We release the pollutant and we clean up again. So it's kind of a never-ending cycle, which is why it's the least effective. It also tends to be very expensive. Okay, let's talk about DDT, because it's one of those classic examples that shows up almost every year on the ESS exams in some way, shape, or form. And what you need to be able to do with DDT is evaluate its use. Why was it used? Why was it helpful? What are the pros? What are the negative impacts of DDT? And then make an argument or a conclusion based on an environmental value system about whether the pros outweigh the cons or vice versa, right? You would definitely not need to know this big long word here, dichlorodiphene-trichloroethane. Just write DDT. That's all you need to know, right? So it was first introduced because it's a great pesticide. It kills mosquitoes, and mosquitoes are pathogen vectors. They carry malaria, dengue, yellow fever, a bunch of other tropical diseases that make people really sick and contribute to early human deaths. Right? Once we figured that out in the mid 20th century, that it was really useful for controlling those insects, it became adapted and used in agriculture to kill agricultural pests, many of whom are also insects. Right? Then, once we realized, kind of thanks to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, published in 1962, that DDT had some pretty significant negative impacts on the environment and on human health, we stopped using DDT. All right. Not only did it kill the mosquitoes, right, but it also had significant and broader impacts on the environment. So here you can see in this map, this is where the species of mosquito that's responsible for spreading malaria existed in South America and parts of Central and North America as well in the 1930s. Then DDT was widely used and essentially wiped out those mosquitoes, except for in a few countries that were still using it. And then after the DDT ban went into place and people stopped using it, they replaced it with something else. Right? Those mosquitoes moved back in and reclaimed their previous territory, which means the incidence of those diseases also rose in those areas. Okay, so its effect on the environment. We know that DDT thins out the shells of bird eggs and results in higher mortality rates among bird species, and that then has an impact on the environment because it disrupts food chains. We also know that DDT is a persistent organic pollutant, so it bioaccumulates in different organisms and then it biomagnifies up the food chain. And so, because it is persistent and it has these detrimental health impacts on your top trophic levels. In addition to that, we know that it has all of these negative impacts on human health. So, you may be asked to construct a systems diagram to show impact of a particular pollutant. When that happens on an exam, you'll probably be given a specific example and asked to comment on it. I can almost assure you that on the ESS exam, you will be asked to evaluate the effectiveness of these 3 tiers of pollution management with reference to a specific pollutant. It won't just be broad where they ask you to describe or explain each of these tiers. They'll ask you to apply it to a particular pollutant and evaluate the effectiveness of each level. Okay? And then you'll probably also encounter some kind of a question about DDT. And it generally falls into this kind of format somehow. State 1 pro and 1 con, or 1 advantage and 1 disadvantage of the use of DDT, and then evaluate its use, or describe its impact on human health, describe its impact on natural ecosystems. All right? That's it for topic 1.5, humans and pollution. If you find this video helpful, please give it a like, consider subscribing to my channel, and I'll be back soon with another ESS video.